Okay.
Greetings. You're listening to Guiding Stars Evolutionary Astrology Radio. This is your host, Kristin Fontana. Guiding Stars is an interactive, soul-centered astrology talk show using the symbolic language of evolutionary astrology to enlighten and empower you on this journey. We're so excited if you're just joining us. This is our third of 12 shows in a series looking at Saturn through the houses and signs with Simon Vorster from Sweden. And Guiding Stars for many, many years, I think about 18 years, was aired at healthylife.net on the internet, and we are transitioning to YouTube without commercials. I know you're all happy about that. So am I. So it's commercial free now, and we are going to be here every month with Simon. I've got other shows airing with Rose Marcus, David Green, and Ari Moshe. And so I'm very excited about this new format. We've got visuals, we've got charts for you to look out at so we can educate you a little better on whatever topic we're discussing in evolutionary astrology. So I'd just like to welcome Simon Vorster back to Guiding Stars. Welcome back.
Thanks very much, Kristin. As always, super excited to be jumping in the show with you and talking about astrology and EA.
Yes, definitely. It's always a joy to gather with other fellow astrologers, and especially to be able to connect so far away, so fast, right? Sweden, I'm in Oregon. It's awesome. So
right.
I asked Simon, as I shared, I think in the last show, we were talking about what should we discuss on Guiding Stars? What do you think people really want to hear about? And gosh, as we march through this year, I continue to hear more and more questions about this stellium of planets in Capricorn that's coming in January of 2020, which was precisely your suggestion. Hey, let's talk about Saturn. Let's really educate everybody on Saturn. It is in Capricorn now, which is the sign that it rules, but there's so much coming in Capricorn. And we are feeling, well, Pluto's in Capricorn, it's been in Capricorn, but we are feeling the pressure of this energy building.
Yeah.
In this country, we are certainly feeling it in this country, but across the world, it's reflected in every country, really. And so when we understand the nature of the archetype, we can understand it a little bit better through transit. Today, we're discussing Saturn in Gemini or Saturn in the third house. So one way to understand this, if you have Saturn in Gemini or the third house, this would be your natal signature. Or perhaps you have transiting Saturn in your third house, and you might be resonating with some of what we're saying. That would mean that you have Capricorn on the cusp of the third house, and perhaps you have a Scorpio rising, it might be.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is a great way to work through all the archetypes, looking at it from a Saturnian perspective. And I'd like to talk about what Saturn represents as an archetype before we get specific to Gemini or the third house, Simon. So okay. I'll let you start this thing.
Sure. I mean, the way I like to approach Saturn, let's start right at the core of the natural law, the evolutionary archetype, and what it's, how it originates from, its origin. And to me, it represents the nature of time. Okay, time and boundaries. It's the formation of a boundary that develops over a movement, so a direction. And the imagery that comes to mind always for me is that when you take like a pebble or a stone or anything that's heavy, and you throw it into the water, when the pebble hits the water, it creates these waves that move in all directions in a circular form. And those little rings that it creates, to me, is the nature of Saturn. I mean, this is like the deepest essence of it, right? And how that then materializes itself within nature and within life is that when you then take, for instance, like a crab or a tree or even your house, you'll start to notice that each of these three things that I've named has this formation of protection around something that is essentially in the middle of it. So like a crab is very squishy inside the middle, and outside it has this exoskeleton. And that exoskeleton is the structure of Saturn. Okay, it is the nature of something that has formed relative to whatever is growing. Okay, the same with a tree, as an example, with the bark on the tree. It is the protection that surrounds the inside, and the same with a house. You have the walls, and then inside the house, you have this protection, or like your valuables, right? This can be the polarity points, or the opposite side of Capricorn, which is Cancer. And so we can even go back to the original process of when we were born, and this is where I get this relationship, this idea of Saturn, that we're looking at the womb, and the womb is the original form in which we are in our most sort of primordial state before we actually come onto the earth. And the womb has got this protective layer around it, and the protection is Capricorn. It is the nature of protection and boundary, and it forms itself when something comes into something that is physical, when it comes into the physical world. And the physical world is governed by Saturn. It's something that we can touch, it's something that's solid, and we can use our five senses. So it's the physical form of reality as we experience it. And when we move from moment to moment, i.e. from, so say for instance, from moment to moment, then the way that we are able to actually feel and know that we are in motion is because our senses are interacting with the physical realm. And so we call this boundaries, right? A boundary. So if we look at time and we say, okay, from 8 o'clock in the morning until 9 o'clock in the morning, we have a meeting. It is the boundary, the form that gets created at 8 o'clock, and then at 9 o'clock, and there's a boundary. And within that context, whatever is existing in there is essentially very Pisces. It doesn't have any, it's just space. So we have time and space. And Saturn is the crystallization. It's the archetypal, the energy that crystallizes the molecules into a dense form. And then that dense form becomes a protection layer around things like a house or a tree or the crab. But it doesn't necessarily just imply that it's a protection. It can be the crystals. So another way that I like to describe Saturn and express Saturn is, and this is when we can come more into something that is more practical to understand, about our emotional memory, our emotional imprinting. And if you had to look at a shell, for instance, or a fossil, when you look at a fossil, it's got this like swirling shape to it. And it reveals to us that something at that moment in time has solidified. So Saturn is the process of crystallizing something into a dense form that holds a memory of a moment. And when Jeffrey used to teach about Saturn, he would always talk about the process of coming from Sagittarius. So just very briefly, Sagittarius being the way that we'd explore cosmology. But when we get to Saturn, it is the process of crystallizing the belief or the cosmology into something that then becomes in human form a boundary or a law or a constitution. It's putting it in place so that we can actually then establish where one thing begins and another thing ends. And that's why, to me, when you look at Saturn in your chart, and when you go and read, astrology texts, always relates to, Saturn being related to metal within an alchemical process. And you're looking at Saturn as the father of time. Through those descriptions, Saturn being very slowing down, depression. It's because this energy is about slowing down things to a point. And in that point, we are able to be, in a sense, still with what we are experiencing in that moment. This is kind of the spiritual aspect of it. And I don't want to go too deep into that because there's a lot of concepts that I've already explained here. But again, the idea of Saturn is something that is forming, that is crystallizing, that is coming into being through a very slow process. So when you have Saturn in your chart, this is where you need to understand that there is it's like a process of slowing down and realizing that over time, the development of something that you are experiencing or going through will be rewarded the more that you give time to that. This is just one of the ways that it can show up as a relationship to your Saturn in your chart. And I'm sure you've got more to share about that.
Yeah, sure. And I will be sharing some things I've shared before. I feel like every time we do talk about any archetype, we tend to talk about it in a different way, yet it means the same thing. You know what I mean? It's just like we're really trying to
Right.
go deeper into that understanding. When sometimes we have to hear things several times, I know I do, in order for it to really cement in me, in my memory, like
Yeah.
Saturn, right?
That's a
So
great
to become,
example, like what you just shared, right? Cement into that, exactly that, into your memory. And you'll notice how you
right.
use those words together. Memory.
Exactly. Yeah. And just the words, Gemini, third house, over and over and over to hear something. That's at least when I've been learning this work over the many years, or just diving into this work in various ways for the past 20 years, because even though we're teaching and counseling, we are also evolving with the work, right? The more we allow ourselves to deepen into our understanding, to osmose the emotional and spiritual energy of these archetypes also, they're all so vast, and they can continue to reveal more to me by the day. It's incredible that way. And I have to say, for anybody with Saturn and Gemini or the third house, who I am sure does get bored easily and does have a need for diversity and variety, I mean, this work will never grow old because there is
Right.
always more to take in. I promise you that.
Mm-hmm.
So, as an archetype, Saturn conditions all of the other archetypes, which I've shared before in the past. It's my favorite way to understand this archetype of Saturn in your chart. So, typically, people who are just learning astrology, of course, they'll know their sun sign, they'll know their moon, their rising sign, or their ascendant. Perhaps you might know a little more about your chart, but maybe you don't know what houses they land in, right? There's so many pages this works, so many layers and levels. But I remember when I really came to understand Saturn, it was really by force. Another Saturn word, I feel. Or maybe it was more authority and direction by Jeffrey, because I, was asked to speak at an evolutionary astrology conference, and I didn't know what to talk about. I had explored the things I felt like I was really well educated on, but Saturn was an archetype or a planet I didn't really want to spend time preparing to talk about, because I just instantly created this heavy feeling in me. I want to talk about something depressing. And
Right.
there's so much more to Saturn than that. I mean, thank God I was forced to talk about Saturn, because I really did come to love learning about this energy and how to work with it, how to understand it, how to allow it to become, or allow it to bolster you in some way instead of to weigh you down. And Saturn is so much about gravity, right? Even the way that you talk about things becoming crystallized in
Yes.
space.
Yes.
And so if Saturn in your chart in Gemini or the third house, that Gemini energy is conditioning every other planet in your chart. It conditions your Mars and your Venus, your relationship planets, which is how you relate to other people, how you attract other people. And it has to do with, it will condition your Mercury, which is how you communicate, and so on. It is such an important energy to understand in your chart. And I know when I really looked at my Saturn by house and signs, so maybe you have Saturn in Gemini, but it sits in a Leo house. Now you've got to take both of those archetypes and combine Gemini and Leo when you're wrapping it around another planet. There's just like so many places you can go with this. So in essence, it's like walking into a house where the walls and the floors and the ceiling are all energized by Gemini or third house energy, right? But in each room of the home, one room might be the moon, right? How you are emotionally wired and connected. But that moon, let's put it in Cancer, it's wrapped with Gemini. So you have to start, this is how you become this astrological detective, right? Or,
Mhm.
you're in the kitchen trying to prepare something to eat and you're looking at a recipe. This is how you look at a chart. How much spice, how much sugar, how much flour, how much whatever it might be. That's how you are able to really bring all of these ingredients in the chart and understand it. So Saturn and Gemini are the third house. This Gemini energy is the backbone of this being. It is
Yeah,
like the skin that wraps around your body to hold in the organs is Gemini or third house. And the soul inside is supported by the archetype of Gemini. And
exactly.
yeah, I just wanted to share is that consciousness, Jeffrey used to teach consciousness of itself is Neptune. Obviously, the soul is Pluto and Scorpio, which has that natural trine to Neptune or Pisces, 12th house. But
Mhm.
consciousness of itself is Neptune. And consciousness is of itself formless, right? That's this Pisces Neptunian energy, like water is. And not even a scientist can tell us what the properties are of consciousness. You can't open up the body and find soul or emotion. Yet we know by our own experience that these things exist. So
Mhm.
when you put that water or that consciousness into form, when you put water into a cup, then it takes a form. When you put soul into body, then it assumes the shape and function of that form. And today, that form is conditioned or energized with Gemini, or maybe you have this archetype in your chart. So that's how to understand how important that Saturn function is and how it's impacting and influencing every other planet in your chart. It conditions everything in your chart. So yeah, I
Yeah.
just wanted to share that
No,
again.
that's amazing. And while you were busy sharing that over there, I was being reminded of some investigation and exploration that I was doing a couple of years ago about the way that the brain gets developed as it interacts with life. And I remember in the medical book that Jeffrey had put together, which was he was saying that the prefrontal cortex is ruled by Saturn, and I liked it because when you look at the development of the brain from the ages of 0 up until 21, one of the reasons why children are so receptive to everything and anything is because their prefrontal cortex has not actually been um, like fully developed. And so because of this, as to the age of 21 at least, because that's when it starts coming in line correctly, all of the conditioning, all of the imprinting that will be experienced from internalizing the father figure, which will generally on some level show up as the Saturn in the chart, because when we're dealing with Saturn over here, and how you were talking about this as it being the framework for conditioning the chart, the soul story is that those archetypes have to be alive within this person's life. So, like in my case, as an example, my Saturn sits in the 10th house Scorpio. At the age of 5, Pluto transits over that Saturn in the 10th house Scorpio, and my mom and dad split. The nature of how that split took place was that the police came to my dad's door and said, "We've got this warrant and we're going to be taking him away from you." And
Whoa.
what I want to put across here is how the archetype of Saturn will condition your chart from the perspective of how it actually feels, like how you actually emotionally relate to this. So for me as a kid, I grew up with this in like very, very intimate, deep sort of imprint of abandonment, loss, betrayal. And it was very interesting that when Jupiter transited over my Saturn last year, I received some paperwork that was related to the divorce that was taking place and how my dad was feeling at that point in time. He had actually passed on, by the way, at the age of 20. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is that how Saturn actually conditions this entire chart will be through these experiences that you will go through in your life, and they will reflect the karma that the soul carries with it. And when I say reflect the karma, I mean the overall structural nature of reality in which the form, Saturn, has held the soul's deeper unconscious memories. So that's how I internalize and understand Jeffrey's teaching there. That essentially what we're dealing with here is that, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, these are outer planets. They exist in a field of invisibleness because we're not actually looking at these planets or these energies from through our eyes, through our senses, Saturn. That's why it's the boundary in consciousness. So when you have like a Pluto transit or Uranian transit, and what arises within you in your life will be archetypes that will represent those symbols. And so the conditioning factor for me has literally, like, I kid you not, this is how it shows up. As I got into, I know this is not Scorpio, Pluto, pardon me, Saturn in the third house here, but just kind of emphasizing the point that you're putting across of how important it is to understand how Saturn conditions your chart. So this is the reason why I'm sharing the example. That throughout my life, in terms of relationship dynamics, because Capricorn rules my 12th, and we're talking about essential needs here, again, not going too deep into it, but just showing how when I get into relationships, I will immediately place or express the unresolved Saturn complex in my chart through the original imprinting that took place when the divorce and the lack of the father that wasn't available there, the abandonment, so the abandonment of the parent, and so on and so forth. That's how it conditions the chart. It's actual events that have happened in your life that when you go through your first Saturn square, your last Saturn square, or your Saturn return, you will experience those dynamics again that the soul will call into your life in order to resolve. So what I want to do today in terms of my sharing with Saturn in the third house is help those that have got this symbolism to really begin connecting and contemplating, what does that mean for you? Like getting connected with your own personal unique stories of how Saturn in the third house shows up. So yeah, when we kind of get into
Yeah,
it.
sure. I mean, as it relates to story that is
Mhm.
Gemini, we put a
Right.
story to it. It's so interesting because, sometimes people will ask me, tell me about my past lives. And of course, the story isn't so much important. It's really about how you feel about what happened. That's important. The
Yes.
energies that are connected to there, because Gemini can get so caught up in the details of something in their head about the story versus the feelings around what happened. And so it creates this separation in a sense in terms of how they understand something versus how they feel about it. But one thing that you brought up, which I feel like is really important just to share here too at this time, is that when you ask the question, how does distant Saturn memory condition our current consciousness? Like for you, the
Mhm.
divorce of a distant memory, how it has proven to condition your consciousness over time in your own relationships
Yeah.
because of what happened then. We also have south node of Saturn in Capricorn
Exactly.
natally. So currently Saturn is transiting in Capricorn. We all have south node of Saturn in Capricorn, and the north node of Saturn is in Cancer, which symbolizes the transition between the matriarchy and the patriarchy. Now, many here on the planet, not everybody, because new souls are being born all the time, but many have memory of either literal memory or cellular memory of a time when people were in conformity with natural law, matriarchy, matriarchal ways and natural principles. All those memories are held in the cells of your body. The time when giving, sharing, and including was the way of life. The natural God, a God of compassion, versus what the patriarchy has created via self-interest and seclusion. Competition, we are right, they are wrong. The US is versus them, the right wing versus the left wing. The natural God, on the other hand, is one of compassion, of matriarchal ways and natural principles. And so what's important to remember is that even if a soul was not born or alive, during the transition, which took about 5,000 years. If there's a soul that was not alive, they will be experiencing these memories just by being on the planet through osmosis, not conscious osmosis, but being in a reality with other people that were there. All these memories are held in the subconscious. And so you want to think about how all of us here on the planet have this signature where we are working to decondition, and not everybody is working hard at that, but I know we are here to decondition, to try and remember how to be natural again.
Right.
And so what you said, Simon, was so important, that in helping other people with their stories and how they have affected, how this conditioning in your chart has affected choices that you've made, how you relate to other people, the fears that come up within you, that's Saturn, your
Yeah.
fear or your resistance to make a move in one direction or another because of the memories that are held in your subconscious, where when you made that choice before that step, there was a consequence to it. So there's going to be some resistance, some fear. What happens if that happens again? Maybe you don't even know why the fear exists because you don't have access to the story, but you can see it within your own chart. And this is why EA is so powerful in terms of helping people release what doesn't need to be there anymore. The
Well,
fear.
let's and again, I know that this is a third house Gemini thing, but just to kind of, keep on emphasizing and really putting across the point of how Saturn shows up in a chart, so that you can begin, this is, for those of you that are listening, to begin starting to develop a relationship to Saturn in a way that is not only coming from a non-shadow place, but it is essentially incarnating its highest principles. So let's talk about that idea of fear, right? And resistance. And also, when you talked about Saturn as an archetype within patriarchy and self-interest and exclusion. So if any of you that are parents out there to young children, I can't begin to recommend this audiobook enough. It's called No Bad Kids. Okay. And it was actually developed by somebody that's Pluto and Leo, and then passed down to somebody that's now, trying to put the work across. And I just love it, only because it has a deep personal relationship to myself. But at the same time, it also emphasizes this idea of human beings osmosing with the distortion of Saturn through the collective, and then seeing that as the natural function of Saturn versus something that's actually wildly off from what its original intention is. And this is something that I feel throughout the series I want to kind of keep on bringing us back to and reminding us, and I'm sure you'll do the same, that Saturn is not an energy that says go go go. It's not about that. It's not about I have to go somewhere and get something and achieve something and be successful. To me, that's not Saturn. Saturn is a deeply yin feminine archetype of inward reflection through experiences, where Saturn will come around and say, okay, this is where I'd like you to there's a certain restrictions that I'm going to place now around your life in this area. And what I want you to do is just kind of slow down, and just pay attention to your inner emotional reality here. I want you to get grounded with what the space is in your life. So that's why during the Saturn return, a lot of people, you just see it, where people just complain about depression, or their life it's all of these things. And what's really happening is Saturn's kind of pulling you to come back home. Saturn return, coming back home. To me, I feel the Saturn return is a point in which we reach a stage in our lives where, for the first one at least, we begin to embark on a deeper spiritual journey of firstly reparenting ourselves. So the idea of reparenting acknowledges the fact that up until this point, a lot of your conditioning, a lot of your boundaries, a lot of the authorities, a lot of the structures that have been in your place represent something that, from Saturn return up to Uranus opposition is going to be a need to soften, to break down the crystallized form of imprinting that you've received about what you think life is, because it's essentially based on the values and principles of your parents and what they believed in their time, and not what the future of the soul holds for itself with Uranus. So the nature of Saturn with this no bad kids is that it talks about the idea of discipline. And disciplining kids is a deeply, deeply damaging thing. And I put it in this way. The idea of discipline in the context of us disciplining kids is about extending authority over somebody that hasn't got the ability to put their own boundaries in place because their sense of self has not been developed, because they don't know where their sense of self is, because they've never got the opportunity to actually express their boundaries, what they like and what they don't like. Because in the patriarchal way, it's you do what I say. I know better. And it deeply, deeply distorts and damages the child's sense of perception of what they feel is correct for them, because it takes on the idea that, of course, we know better, right? Whereas the idea of establishing healthy boundaries between yourself and the child, Saturn, okay, allows for your sense of self, Saturn, right? Because remember, it's part of this, this connection between Aries, which is I, Libra, the other I, Cancer, my feelings, the other person's feelings. So when we approach this idea of discipline from a place that's not about this myth to establish control based on laws that are put in place from a collective ideology that says, this is how you should behave. And if you're not behaving in accordance with these boundaries, then you're misbehaving. What we're really saying when we assert these boundaries is you are not conforming to the way that maybe disturbs my emotional peace or the rules of the society. And so we conform ourselves. We get into the state of restriction and constriction, and that stops our growth. Because growth and life, if you ever put like a lid on top of a tree, at some point when the tree hits the lid, it's going to be like, look, dude, I want to go up, but now I'm going to grow to the side, or I'm going to go in random places. Because life is not about growing in constriction. Creativity doesn't flower in constriction. Even though Saturn is a constricting archetype where it allows for boundaries of growth to take place when it is in a process of healthiness. So Saturn in its healthy state is about guidance. It's about support and putting boundaries in place in which the capacity for whatever is in those boundaries can experience life. So like for a child, for instance, a parent says this, I can't let you put those shoes on right now. Starting with Aries, I can't let you. So the child immediately connects to, this is another person that's connecting to me, not we don't do that, or you shouldn't do that. Because when it's we, it's some abstract notion of who's we versus I. So this teaching of Saturn in its healthy state is the realization of how we are able to establish strong boundaries. And when we have strong boundaries, we create strong intimacy, because then it's about meeting another person in a relationship, right? Okay, I expect this from you, you expect that from me, and we can deal with each other. So, and I'm going to stop over there, because the point that I'm putting across is the idea of how Saturn in the chart up until this point in time, so wherever you've got this, like in this case, Saturn in the third house, you'll have this constriction around your own voice, your sense of what can I communicate? Because on some level, you would have osmosed from the collective the idea that your voice wasn't good, right? Or authority showed up in your life in which they experienced the constriction or a damaged sense of Saturn that shows up and says, you're not allowed to do that. You can't speak like that. You write with your left hand, Gemini and the Saturn in the third house, you're different. And why do you write with your left hand? Like, so really, really trying to emphasize that reworking Saturn in your chart is a very, very healthy thing to do, and can provide you with an immense amount of healing when you begin to rework the language and the definition and the construct of how it's been shaped in your life. So I'm going to pause there, because I know it's a lot of sharing at the moment, and just kind of hear your thoughts on that.
That was excellent. I love too the part of how you described why discipline is the way it affects a child, how and they're not able to defend themselves. And they don't have an understanding of this boundary. And I'm a product of extreme discipline, I will say,
Mm-hmm.
where the belt came out, all the kids got the belt a few times. And
Yeah.
I mean, really what that does is it permanently damages the relationship. There's
Yep.
the trust is gone, the feeling of safety is gone.
Yes.
All the kids we just retreated and shut down. And then, we were close really to my mom only, and just in very limited degrees to my dad because of that. So yeah, that was excellent. Thank you for that.
So with like Saturn in the third house, part of the type of damage that can take place for some of us that are older, of course, that are not, being raised at the moment by parents. Basically, on some level, you will carry with yourself a shadow complex of Saturn, where from Freud's terms and Jung's terms, it's the superego, where there's an inner critic that says to you, no, you can't do that. No, you can't do this. So to me, Saturn in third house, one of the things that you want to break down within your structure is working your own relationship to yourself about how you parent. So to me, when you begin to work with Saturn in your chart, it's about reparenting the authority that's rooted in your own sense of self. So with Saturn in the third house, part of your karma can come into this lifetime where you are growing, Saturn growing into, remember, growth, physical form, a plant grows, human being grows, your conscious awareness is growing as you are housed by your Saturn body. You're growing into the experience of, maybe being curious, asking some questions. Depending on what your natal chart looks like, it can range from having to allow yourself more curiosity to explore more. You might have, say, Pluto in your first house as an example. Or on some level, you might be learning to sort of constrict or slow down on where you're, like you said earlier, Kristin, like all over the place and getting too many opinions of other people and then losing your own sense of truth, right? Remember that with Gemini, the polarity is Sagittarius. So coming into a state of beginning to explore what the truth means for you, as in your own reality.
Yeah, and I would say just because a lot of people I remember Jeffrey said this when somebody was asking him about, somebody was claiming that when the soul, when the soul reaches, if the soul dies before they're 70, then they don't have any more karma left with anyone in their life. And someone was quoting some other thought leader on the subject, apparently, and Jeffrey said, just because somebody said it doesn't mean it's true.
Right.
Like that's a Saturn and Gemini. Just because someone wrote about it doesn't mean it's true.
Mm-hmm.
And just because somebody believes something doesn't mean it's true. The truth doesn't require belief. It's just where we have to be careful when we are taking in information.
Yeah.
And really doing a gut check on ourselves, whether, it's amazing what that kind of information could do to somebody who took in that message wholesale, lock, stock, and barrel,
Exactly. And I mean, that just points to, so Gemini has a natural square to Virgo, and Virgo keeps pointing to Gemini saying, okay, your role within consciousness is essentially to gather, essentially to acquire as much information as possible. And my role, Virgo, is to kind of organize it and to really assess which information is relevant and which is not, so that when I ask the Sagittarius question, the pursuit for the deeper truth can arise out of something that's very, that's very specific. And then that eventually leads us to the actual experience itself with Pisces. So, Gemini is part of the mutable cross, and it talks about that need for discernment, while simultaneously also, in a sense, remaining open as a process of a gathering, so that it doesn't become polarized, where it's, I'm not going to hear anybody's opinion, to, oh, I'm just hearing everybody's, right? It's about really, really becoming sensitive to information that, like you said, it has a sense of resonance. It's felt in the gut, and asking the question, like curious about it. Okay, really, really thinking it through. Okay, this person said this. Well, let's try and objectify it. Let's try and explore it. What is the deeper essence of what's been trying to say here? That's what I've noticed with my own moon in Gemini process, even though it's not Saturn, but my moon, definitely wants to explore, but it also needs to make sure that what is the essence of it.
That's good. I mean, I think the Gemini function, whether it's the moon or any prominent planets in the third, or Saturn and Gemini for sure, is all about collecting as much information as you can in order to come up with what you feel is true. So, it's to me, Saturn and Gemini is so much an energy of researching
Yes.
people that I know that have Saturn in the third house or in Gemini. They seem to know a lot about a lot of things, not just a little about a lot of things. They tend to really, it can be someone who even claims to be an expert. And I would go so far to say, well, most of them are more of an expert than I am, because they take the time really to just cover as many bases as they possibly can.
Right. Right.
So it's a lot different than having another planet in the third house. To have Saturn and Gemini, they want to be the authority on this information. They are going to look everywhere to make sure that they know everything they possibly can about it.
I loved what you said there about becoming the authority in that place. From my experience, not only with working with my own personal Saturn, but also witnessing clients in their Saturn process, that becoming an authority where your Saturn is a very big part of is a very big part of the sort of like evolutionary intention of Saturn in your chart. This is where, if you put the time in, you dedicate yourself through, slow progressive movement over time, every single day, just give yourself an hour to research the thing that you're doing over there, and you grow, by the time you reach your Uranus opposition and beyond, you step into that realm of having a lot of time and energy invested into something that has deepened your relationship to it. And people will naturally see you as an authority figure there. And that's what's the beauty between the healthy authority and the distorted one. Because we know that Saturn will want to oppress anything that it feels insecure about, because it wants to be in control, it wants to be dominating. Whereas in its natural form, people will naturally see you as somebody that is knowledgeable or authoritative in this area, and seek your counsel or wisdom. And that's the subtle difference. I know this, and this is what you should do, versus I'm sharing this information because there is a boundary I'm aware of, because my experience of it I've had. I know where the boundary is. I know where it's safe to go and where it's not safe to go, and people, that's what the elders are. I mean, if you look at like Star Trek, for instance, at least the first film, where both of the main characters go and seek the council, and you can see that their role is about saying, okay, this is a great idea, and here are certain things that you need to watch out for, just as the parent does for the child. The child wants to explore the world. It wants to imagine and experience its senses. And the parent is there as a boundary to say, okay, you're 5 years old right now. You're comfortable doing this, but I know that you're not comfortable being able to handle 7-year-old tasks. And so I can't let you experience this right now. And then kind of guide the child into, let's go do that instead. Whereas generally it's, no, you can't do that. Why are you so stupid? You see the subtle difference over there.
Yeah. I thought of a perfect example. We don't have a chart for this well-known figure because I didn't think about it until we were talking. But the man we call Jesus
Oh, yes.
has a third house, Saturn, a stellium of planets in Pisces in the third house, Jupiter, Uranus, Sun, Saturn, Venus, Vesta, Moon, all in the third house. His chart's in the Pluto book. He's a ninth house Pluto. If you want to find his chart quickly, there's no birth data shown here. It's very tricky to try and enter that in Solar Fire. It always makes my Solar Fire freeze for some reason. But anyway, the chart, I wonder why. But anyway, of course, the third house is about being a messenger, right? And he
Yes.
was, don't shoot the messenger is the famous expression. But, here is a man who was crucified for being a messenger. His Saturn in Pisces opposes his Mars in the ninth house in Virgo. So, of course, he sacrificed his soul, his self, for these teachings, for these natural teachings. And Pluto was also up there with Mars. So Saturn's opposing Mars and Pluto in the ninth house. All right. So people that disagreed with his message and made him an enemy, right? And
Yeah.
so what is all reflected in this chart, so you could be a messenger, a teacher, a communicator of some information. And wow, the power of these symbols even shown in the chart relative to all of this, of course, being crucified for what he knew and what other people felt threatened by, because it went against their own idea of what was true for
Sure.
them.
I know this doesn't directly correlate to that specifically, but I think it's important to note that with Saturn in the third in Pisces, in his case, with all the other planets over there, you can see how his message over time was deeply distorted by
Oh, yeah.
people that wanted it for their own self-interest. And so instead of the parables of his teachings becoming something that would help people illuminate their own self-awareness and the relationship to a deeper self, it became a controlling mechanism that would essentially influence people into believing things that were deeply existential and not inwardly.
Right. It's like the man on the throne, the
Hmm.
idea of some male dominating male on a throne that was God. And they rewrote the book, so to speak, in order to serve themselves.
Right.
And then it's been taught, at least in more original texts, that he spent a great deal of time in India and learned in monasteries, etc. And what he was teaching people when he came back to Jerusalem was how to access the God within, not to go to an intermediary like to a priest or pray to Mother Mary. You go directly within, and that we are all hardwired to have this experience. The South Node is in Scorpio in the 11th house. Hardwired, your soul is hardwired to have this experience. The ruler of that is Pluto in the ninth with Mars in Virgo, teaching people that they can have this direct experience as well. And so in terms of the Pisces stellium too, the teachings around connecting to God, this universal truth through meditation, through prayer, and also, of course, his big teaching on taking care of those that don't have what you have, right? The last shall come first. And that's his Mars in Virgo in the ninth, opposing that stellium as well. His message was so much about helping the downtrodden, or even women. He had a very active role. Even his right hand person was a woman, Mary
Right.
Magdalene. And the disciples were actually jealous of her connection to him. And so, of course, these men are rewriting the Bible to serve them in
Yeah.
ways that it wasn't true at all. And that's also reflected in the polarity of this Virgo Pisces stellium that he has.
That's right. That's right. Um, did you want to? Shall we look at two charts that we've
Sure.
got for this meeting? Okay, so um, this is somebody that you're familiar with, and
Yes. So earlier I was talking about being an authority and somebody that really has taken the time to collect as much information as possible here. And one area that I feel this particular soul as a woman is as an authority has to do with homeopathy and medicine, natural medicines. This is definitely someone who in a tribe in past lives was kind of like the homeopathic doctor of the tribe, all that Virgo energy there in the 12th. And Saturn and Sagittarius retrograde is about having a natural understanding about health, right?
Yep.
Jupiter's the ruler of that Sag and Virgo in the 12th. So to help the body's immune system to get stronger from the herbs, the tinctures, the medicines. She is definitely a medicine woman, this particular soul. And notice too that every house cusp is 29 and change. So
Wow, look at that. That's
this is a life of culminating so many dynamics in her life, and one major is her her experience with the patriarchy and her own conditioning from the past. And so there have been some different experiences along the way where she's had to she's had these past lives triggered or activated because of interfacing with authorities or the law, so to speak. And you can see how she would have been persecuted in past lives for her knowledge with medicine, right?
yeah.
And it's kind of like all the witches that are burned at the stake. I mean, she does have Pluto, Mars, Balsamic in the 11th and Leo, right? For whether you're an herb gatherer or a midwife, or you don't have to be some witch hovering over a crystal ball to have been persecuted for using nature to support what you feel is best for somebody, right? So it's this, all these themes in this chart. She's also loves to write and is a good writer and has a great understanding about natural laws and natural teachings, but a perfectionist, really to a fault, right? So less about being Jupiterian in the writing and more about being Saturnian, which is wanting it to be hyper organized and hyper structured, right? Crossing T's, dotting I's to almost excessively. So Gemini is not like that inherently, but then you put Saturn in the third house, and they can be very judgmental about these things, and in this case never feels good enough, right? Or perfect,
Right.
because the ruler is in Virgo in the 12th house here. So constantly editing, re-editing, editing again over and over and over and over and over again.
Yeah, and you can see that. No, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I like the repeating themes in the chart where you've got Venus conjunct Mercury. They're in Virgo in the 12th house. And then you've got that whole entire second house, Neptune, North Node, Moon structure. And like you were saying, that this person really was working on being able to rewrite their relationship to themselves in a way that was, their unique truth.
Right. Absolutely. And, really having the courage to be able to come forward with whatever felt was natural, even if it was not mainstream,
Right.
having the courage to do that. This didn't occur for this woman, but I want to give an example. This would be like somebody who got very involved with marijuana as medicine before it became legal in many places now in the U.S., but in where I live, in I think California, Oregon, Washington, it's all legalized. But a lot of people were trying to use this for pain and for medicine before it was legal, and were getting in trouble, of course, when they got caught. This didn't happen with her, but I can imagine how if someone had a chart like this, this is a perfect example of what it would look like, right?
Yeah.
So you're trying to hide something with the 12th house for people that are sick, Virgo, right? And maybe you're trimming the marijuana. You're involved with that, and you get caught, or it could be anything like that. But obviously, it's finally become legalized a lot of places for good reason. But especially the people that really need it. But that would be an example of how you could run into some issue that would trigger all the trauma from the past of literally, being caught and then having to die for it or burn for it. So
It's really
Yeah.
interesting as well, because the Uranus, that's, so Saturn's retrograde, so we'll look to Uranus to really give us an indication of what the Saturn's all about in the chart as well. Because I remember Jeffrey writing that, it's actually in the EA glossary, with when Saturn's retrograde, these types of souls will find it more difficult to integrate within the fabric of reality, because their own nature is so different to the sort of conditioning field of Saturn direct values and laws and regulations, because it's influenced deeply by Uranus, and Uranus being at 7 degrees over there, and the nodes being at 15, and Scorpio, Taurus, Uranus squaring that node. So there's definitely, to me, a kind of tendency that can be activated, that Uranus can be activated, unresolved trauma of wanting to, deeply express themselves in a natural way, and finding a sort of crisis in belief, or a crisis in faith, or even experiencing criticism, like you said, like judgment or persecution, the Mercury, Venus, that's squaring the Saturn in the third. So I wonder if did this soul have to work through some of those internalized belief structures about themselves that maybe were experienced as a young child, like you're not allowed to do this. This is not the right belief to have. Or were there certain dynamics within the family where the family conditioning had a belief system that this person felt different about, and they had to kind of reconcile
It
their.
wasn't so much, yeah, well, it was that you're right on the money here. It wasn't so much about growing up, the family being uh, you know, involved in some kind of religion that wasn't mainstream or anything like that. It was, kind of a traditional upbringing, not a big family, not a lot of money, as you can see
Okay.
through the Virgo, but it was really more later when that became an issue. You can see how alternatively minded this person is too, with this
Absolutely.
in the 11th, Saturn retrograde. So, finding her people, finding her tribe, finding her way, became a challenge over time. And the classic, I would say, getting married to the wrong person for certainly came to be early on, and then a divorce occurred and all of that. But yeah, it had everything to do with beliefs that challenged her truth, for sure.
Right.
And so this is reflected in terms of feeling like Saturn squaring, how that affected her inner relationship to herself, how it affected how she felt about herself, how it challenged what she knew to be true and what she believed. It did that every day. It
Exactly.
still does that at times, yeah. And so this is the hardest thing about evolving, because when you are in a window where your soul is being, you know, pushed through something, squeezed through something, and you have to trust that what you are going through and what is right for you, you know, is in place, and that you've got to keep pressing on no matter what's coming at you, projections, judgments, threats, whatever it might be. That truth that to be yours inside of you must be stronger than any fear, or you will not get anywhere, right? You will not travel any distance. You will just stay in that spot, and things will repeat, you
Right.
know? So,
Yeah, it just, when I see this chart over here and I look at the Pisces ruling the 7th house and Virgo ruling the first, I remember Jeffrey talking also about the 7th house being something that's more about what people see, whereas your first house right sign is, so much about your own internal process. And, to the outside, this person can see as this really like healing type of soul that's caring and, wants to support the deep healing process in their arts and craft. And like you said about the natural law of healing through medicine and homeopathy and stuff. And yet that rising sign Jupiter points to such a process of needing to purify their own beliefs about themselves that have been accumulated from patriarchal times, that serves as a kind of like that Uranus on the sun, where there's a deep need in this lifetime to really actualize themselves in a way that's organic to their own process. And yet within the context of that process, there's these memories that show up of almost a sense of, okay, if I do this, will it work? Or not necessarily like that type of language, but definitely always having to cross-question her own inner truth and validate it for herself. But to the outside, it can appear as if she's just, doing what she's doing. But her internal process must be so much more intense with that moon on the North Node, really, 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 really trying to liberate herself from those pre-existing ideologies that, probably pushed her away from a sense of trust potentially. And that might not even be this lifetime where she realized that, but it definitely, I'm curious, when I see this chart, how that internal process has been a big part of her own healing journey personally, as that Virgo is showing so much there, like a gestation period of cultivating a new value around her intellectualized cosmology and her beliefs.
Well, I would say that this is a chart of maximum evolution,
Right.
and that what she has come to know is that she cannot attach to outcomes, and she must, or it's like surrendering all attachment to anything physical. All right, because her only attachment would be to her spiritual process, to God, essentially.
Yeah.
God, goddess. That is Venus with Mercury in the 12th, that 29 and 48 minute Virgo rising, attaching to nothing but her evolution into God, and just showing up every day in the best way that she knows how to make this world better, to heal it in whatever way she knows how, and just putting out whatever efforts that she can within her own being, that reflects, again, the values and the effort, right? We talk about with the second house. And also so many themes around self-reliance and being thrown back on herself in many ways, at times feeling very alone on the journey, and yet necessary, as all souls will experience at certain places. Even the most advanced souls in advanced state, spiritual state, will experience emotional hits like Yogananda, and all the rest. Losing his mother so young. It's a necessary part of evolution, and I would say that this particular life has required a certain level of intensity so she can resolve and evolve, really culminate and heal certain things from the past. She does have Uranus squaring the nodes, remember, so there's a lot of PTSD. She came into this life with a lot of unresolved trauma, that connects to her feeling different. And so it's been one of those lives where all I feel like she really cared about ultimately was living her truth, taking her own fingerprint on the way that she's designed and maximizing that expression in simple ways, in bigger ways. And so that's what it's been about, to just recover her nature in essence. And a lot of that connects to being a medicine woman. So yeah, this is a good example of that.
Yeah, completely.
You think about nature, you think about gardens, you think about plants and the variety that exists. It's limitless, right? The species, everything that you have to combine in order to create a medicine. That's so third house, right? You're pulling from all these different types of plants and making.
I like
It makes it all, really.
Yeah, I like the Mercury there as well, and Virgo, the sensitivity to knowing, which thing specifically goes with which thing as you're gathering loads of things with the Saturn third house,
Uh-huh.
what goes in what order, because you can't just like put a bunch of plants together and go, okay, it's working. There needs to be a kind of alchemical process, and that ability to be intuitively sensitive to that at a deeper level really allows this person's capacity to create profound healing from the understanding of the deep mineral and or the mineral structure of plants.
I just remembered something that I think is really important, because, and she always really blesses the mother, which she sees the mother as Gaia and planet Earth, right? Nature.
Mm-hmm.
And so the heart of the mother is something she would always talk about as it relates to how the mother gives back to us through this planet, right? Through a plant, through what we have here naturally. And so there's such an honoring of the mother. And the place where I feel she gets nurtured the most is, whether it be meditating in nature somewhere, being with what she calls the mother. She's from a big family, and I think was kind of younger, so didn't get the nurturing that most kids would like to have, right? And so very much on her own to kind of take care of herself early on, with that moon on the north node in the second. So she found comfort in nature and found comfort in what she would call the arms of the mother, which is Gaia to her. And that's where she would, pull her medicines from, right? These plants. And so it's a very feminine thing, this planet to her. It is Mother Nature, right? The heart of the mother. That's what she, I wouldn't say she worships, but she honors, and where she feels held, directly held in those spaces.
Well, look at that moon on the north node, right?
Yeah. And remember, we evolved through the emotional body. We evolved through these emotional experiences that we have in our life. And so to put the moon on the north node in Scorpio, it restates this need to come through the emotional body to re-enter these traumatic pieces of the past through that Uranus square the nodes and that 11th house, to try and rewire that circuitry, right? To emotionally to re-innervate the emotional body was really a big part of this. Like, when we experience stress in some way, instead of instantly detaching, learning to feel through it and to trust what you're feeling and not reverting to the past, the fear of the past, the trauma of the past, but trusting in herself to be able to feel through what she needs to make the right choices, so she doesn't keep recreating the past. And that's a big evolutionary shoot for anybody, to lean on yourself, to lean on your God, to lean on the mother, to lean on that Piscean, Neptunian reality or world for comfort and support and sustenance and connection.
Yep.
It's essential.
Completely. It's a beautiful way that you kind of channeled that Saturn in the third house, where you've really communicated that natural law in that way.
Yeah. Well, she embodies that. And so if somebody was not born, or someone was not at her same stage of evolution, I would say first stage spiritual, and they were born the same time, same chart, this would play out in a different way. Perhaps, if they were a consensus state individual. So we do have to look at the chart in terms of stage of evolution.
Oh yeah, completely.
Not everybody with Saturn and Sag is going to be operating from natural law.
Well, like with Saturn and Sagittarius in a consensus state, Saturn's operating through very much its most its youthful stage, which is, I don't have a sense of I. I don't know my sense of ego structure, so I'm sort of assimilating into the collective sense of ego, which is, a consensus reality. These are the laws. This is why you abide by. And so whatever belief or ideologies at the time are, being pushed through the collective. This is a type of person that can easily be somebody that will fanatically push their truth across
Mm.
in a way that can be even sometimes deeply narcissistic, with the sun in Leo over there, in a way where it's, well, this is the only truth. How could you believe in anything else other than that? So that Virgo Mercury stuff over there could actually create or manifest certain crises within within the soul, that will eventually lead it to the realization that, that not all truths, or not one truth is the answer. But that's a very broad stroke expression of how that Saturn could show up.
Right. And I just thought of something really important about Saturn. Not everybody studying this work, like myself, had the good fortune of having parents that were showing them astrology at a young age. It wasn't until my Saturn return that I actually got a reading done. I was not even dabbling in it in my 20s. I started studying astrology after that reading because I was so blown away. I had a reading because a lot was going on around my Saturn return that had me asking myself a lot of questions that no therapist or friend or otherwise could answer. So someone had recommended that I talk to an astrologer, and I thought, cool, that sounds fun. Hopefully they can help me. That was it at 28 or 29 years old. And so if you look at someone's life from their, let's say they were born into, as this person was, it was just this chart, born into a more traditional family, it probably wasn't until her Saturn return, or maybe the first Saturn square or so in the 30s, where her soul was kept catching up to where she was in terms of her stage of evolution from another life. Like, she came through a traditional family, she came through corporate America in her 20s, and it wasn't until some big transits were going on in her 30s that she really had this awakening to who she was. And then everything accelerated. It was like a catalyst. It was like pedal to the metal. And as soon as she had this awakening of sorts, where it's a little bit like being plugged in to something like that 11th house, plugged into the memories of who she is, all it really took was for her to be in contact with other people like her,
Mm-hmm.
a little bit like her, interested in the similar things, to have all these memories in the cells of her being to come alive again. And when that occurs in the soul, like, you can look back and say, wow, I sure look like a consensus soul growing up. Corporate America, traditional family. Her soul chose that reality to hide behind who she was. Look at the 12th house, hiding behind her nature. Saturn and Sag is ruled by Jupiter in the 12th, so she would be safe. So she wouldn't be burned for it or whatever else. So it takes coming through that whole Saturn cycle, Saturn returning, coming into your 30s sometimes, in this case, before you have the courage to remember who you are naturally, how God designed you naturally. And so since then, this life has been about recovering herself in full.
You can completely see that. I mean, that was what I was putting across earlier in the conversation about Pluto transiting over my own Saturn, and emphasizing the point of Saturn being the, that you were sharing about Saturn being the conditioning field for the whole entire chart in that way, because it's the physical form, it's the actual physical life, and it's circumstances and situations that you can't run away from. So restriction, here you are. So her first Saturn return was all about, coming into the realization that this was the karma that she was carrying, and now needed to reparent this dynamic, restructure the form of her early life conditioning, in which she realized that this was not her truth, Saturn in the third. And when she communicated that truth, or tried to communicate that truth, it was severely sort of like restricted or constricted through fear or whatever other dynamics. And that kind of led to what was very clear about the Saturn, the Uranus square the nodes, where the resolution of the node is actually the south node, i.e.
Uh-huh.
looking at what the soul needs to do to recover, which node, which part of the chart does it need to recover. So the recovering part would be the south node. So she's recovering her abandoned value, her abandoned self-worth, that deep sense of disempowerment that's linked with her own, inner value. So
A big part of that too, with the ruler of the South Node in Taurus being Venus with Mercury in Virgo, is she had to change the way she thought about herself.
there we go.
All the inner tapes had to totally change and morph. It's like anytime a negative thought would come in, she'd have to immediately create a counter thought.
Yep.
And so that was necessary to re-empower herself in this life, and to not attach to what anybody else thought of her. Only what the mother thought of her.
the primordial mother.
The heavenly, not the heavenly, yeah, Mother Nature. Right. This is a big chart. It's a very big chart. It's a very big life. And we also can see with the nodes stationary, it creates an extra little exclamation point. And we see with Pluto and Mars balsamic, Venus and Mercury balsamic. Both the rulers of the nodes are balsamic.
Yeah.
To Mars, Venus is balsamic to the chart ruler. Mars is balsamic to Pluto, which rules the north node and the moon. The sun and Uranus are also balsamic. It's like, oh my God.
Time to finish it up.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, I think, do you feel comfortable with what we shared so far in today in terms of our meeting? And
I do, if you do.
yeah, me too. I think we've spent quite a lot of time talking about some really amazing things, and I feel like this is a deeply valuable conversation to anybody that's listening, even if it might not be specifically just about Saturn in the third house, but there's loads and loads of amazing things shared.
Well, the thing here is that with evolutionary astrology, we don't like to stay on the surface, right? We're sharing
Yes.
a lot of foundational principles in this one chart, whether it's planets squaring the nodes, the phasal aspects, and the planetary pairs, and it's loaded, this
Completely.
particular chart. And also with Gemini, a lot of times the tendency might be to scratch the surface of things, even if you're getting a lot of information from a lot of sources, and you put it in set, right? We want to see the whole of this story in one, or as much as we can. And so I think it was appropriate really to teach this archetype in this way, and to also put it in a sign which is the polarity of that Saturn and Gemini, right? It's a Sagittarius, so it's how it's evolving. And I came across a quote that I love. It's from a book, Gemini here, of War of Art by Stephen Pressfield, and he writes, the more important a call or action is to our soul's evolution, the more resistance we will feel toward pursuing it. And it's true, that this soul knows this, that when we are up against fear, or we are up against something that is really monumental for our soul's evolution,
Oh no, I think we might have lost you, Kristin.
was sharing that at any evolutionary transition that your soul might be undergoing, the more you'll feel a greater resistance, because there are memories in the past of maybe when you've tried it and you weren't successful, or you were too afraid to tackle it for whatever reason. But to remember that if not now, then when?
Exactly.
So why not now?
Exactly. Okay, so let me do this for everybody that tunes into us and listens to us and can find out where we exist on the internet, and if they would like to talk to us more about stuff. This is our individual websites.
And I'd also like to let the listeners know, if you would like to know more about evolutionary astrology and the body of work that Simon and I both have been trained in, and it's our way of life for us at this point, but schoolofevolutionaryastrology.com is where you can learn more about evolutionary astrology, or of course by reaching out to Simon or myself. But within the school's website is a message board where you can post questions. And if you're interested in getting the original teachings, there's a correspondence course there, which I highly recommend. And Jeffrey Wolf Green was the founder of this work, and his original school is available on that website. So thank you so much, Simon, for today. And we'll be back next month with Simon, looking at Saturn in Cancer, or Saturn in the 4th house. And I will be here again next week with Rose Marcus to discuss the transits in April. So until next time, namaste.